Now, I have personally tested almost all of the popular full frame E mount lenses over the last couple of years, and I am settled on the absolute best for your Sony camera. I'm Austin Jackson, a landscape photographer based in Southern Utah. Today, I'm going to show you why I think this new or new ish Rokinon Samyang 14 to 24 f2.8 for Sony is the absolute best ultra wide zoom for Sony full frame cameras. Now, I've had the chance to test many of the other f2.8 lenses, including the Sony 16 to 25, the Tamron 17 to 28, the Sigma 14 to 24, and the Sony 12 to 24. Now, when considering the needs that photographers need when buying an ultra wide, which is most likely going to be landscape photographers, the Rokinon 14 to 24 f2.8 is going to be my go-to choice. And in this video, I will explain to you why. Now, to start, I feel like it's important to let you know this video is not sponsored. In fact, I actually paid for this lens, paid full price for it on Amazon. And I'm even going to start the video with one of the bad experiences I had with this lens. So the first copy that I purchased on Amazon was delivered, worked fine for about a week. Second time I went out to shoot, I had an issue where the focus was not activating at all. Neither the manual nor the autofocus was working, making the lens literally useless because you couldn't dial in focus at all. I reached out to the Rokinon customer service, figured they might just swap out the lens for me. Unfortunately, instead of doing that though, they told me I should send the lens in for repair, which was absurd considering I only owned the thing like 1 week. So anyways, I'm glad I bought it on Amazon because I was able to return it and then get a new copy, which is this one, which has had no quality control issues. I think in the past, Rokinon has been known for having some lenses with quality control problems. So that disappointed me, and that was something I was worried about buying this. But now the reason why I've waited so long to make this video was to make sure this was good to go. I've had this for over 8 months, no issues with it. And that is really just why I waited so long. So let's get into the specs of this lens that really make it the best for Sony full frame shooters. We're going to kind of start here and talk about how this lens stacks up to some of the competition, and then we'll get into like some of the specifics of the lens itself. So for me and many other photographers out there, image quality is a big factor. And I found this lens to be really comparable to all of the other options on the list. If you were to test this in a completely controlled indoor environment, maybe you'd be able to pick up some small discrepancies. And I'm sure there's videos out there that cover those really small discrepancies. But I found that when shooting this outside, when wide open, even at mid apertures, the image quality on this lens was excellent. And compared to the other options that I've tested, it was on par. They were all about the same. Now, this lens does have really severe vignetting at 14 millimeters, but this is kind of to be expected on a 14 millimeter lens with this flat front element. And this was something I was frustrated by originally when I got the lens because I didn't have a way to fix that vignetting. But I figured out because Lightroom didn't have the profile in there, I went on Rokinon's website, downloaded the profile, and then uploaded it to Lightroom, and then the vignetting fixes perfectly. So that was really nice. Something that you definitely need to know if you buy this lens, to go on their website and download that profile. Now for astrophotography, which is definitely going to be a popular niche for this lens, found that it offered excellent sharpness even when shot wide open and had very, very little chroma distortion in the corners. Now the vignette is again very strong, but again, correct that with the lens profile that you can download. When looking at the image quality of an ultra wide lens, you're really just looking for something that's comparable to the rest, which this lens is. The real moneymaker for me as a landscape and astrophotographer really comes in the specs of the lens. So I really was just hoping that the image quality would match everything else, which it does. When I first started shooting, the widest lens that I had for my camera was 17 millimeters, and I found that to be not wide enough in many cases when I wanted to get really close to my foreground element, like we like to do so often as landscape photographers. So I switched to the Sony 16 to 25 after that, which I still have here. And having that extra 1 millimeter on the widest end was nice, but I did still find the same thing. I wasn't quite wide enough. And then, then I got this 14 millimeter. I found that the difference between 16 and 14 millimeters is massive, especially if you're a photographer that likes to get really close to those subjects. That 14 millimeter just creates that really interesting otherworldly looking image, whereas that 16 millimeter creates something very, very similar, but you can't quite get as crazy with it and creative as you can with that 14. So that having that 14, that extra 2 millimeters on the wide end, doesn't sound like a lot, but it did make a big difference for me. Anytime we talk about the best wide angle lens, I do think we have to consider how important that is, and having that 14 millimeters is definitely a huge plus. So again, when I'm comparing this to other lenses, I'm just comparing them to zoom lenses. There is a lot of great primes out there, 12 millimeter, 14 millimeter, primes that you can definitely buy. But I think as a landscape and astrophotographer, having that zoom on the ultra wide end is really, really important, and it's far superior to that prime lens. So we're going to be comparing this to the other zooms. And again, that's why I think it is the best wide angle zoom for full frame Sony shooters. Now, another factor that I think is important to consider is the weight of the lens. If you are someone who's getting this lens for astro or landscapes, there's a good chance you're like me and you hike or travel to your locations. You carry your equipment. For me, weight is a huge factor. I don't want to carry around a ton of heavy lenses and heavy equipment. Now, the Rokinon 14 to 24 f2.8 weighs just under a pound. It's 15.7 ounces. It's comparable to many of the other wide angle options, and it is far lighter and cheaper than the other 14 millimeter options. Now, the Tamron 17 to 28 and then this Sony 16 to 25 both weigh around an ounce less. But you do give up that extra 1 or 2 millimeters on the wide end, which, as I mentioned before, I think that's very important and well worth the extra 1 ounce. Now, comparing this to the other 14 millimeter options, it's substantially lighter, like around a pound lighter than those other options. So it's really a no-brainer. If you want that 14 millimeters, this thing is so much lighter and it's cheaper as well. Now, one of the nicest things about this lens is the front element. Most other 14 millimeter lenses use a rounded front element, which means you cannot use those standard screw-in filters that you probably already own. And some options like the Sigma 14 to 24 do have options for rear drop-in filters, but it is definitely a pain having to purchase and carry separate filters for just one lens. This 14 to 24 is actually a flat front element, just a screw-in thread here, and it takes standard 77 millimeter filters that you probably already own for some of your other lenses. I was certainly pretty surprised to find out that you can use a filter, and I definitely thought there would be vignetting. I tested this with higher quality thin filters, and there is not vignetting with only one filter. Now, if you stack multiple filters, you will probably have a little bit of vignetting, but with one filter, there is surprisingly no vignetting, which is actually pretty incredible when you consider the specs of this lens. This automatically puts this above the other 14 millimeter or wider options, because filters, I think especially circular polarizers, are crucial for landscapes. A lot of astrophotographers even use things like light pollution filters, which all of these can be used without getting vignetting on this lens. So we've covered a lot of the reasons why this lens performs better than some of the other options, but we should actually talk a little bit about the build of this lens, because if you're thinking about buying it, you probably have some questions about the build. One of my favorite features is having the ability to connect the lens to your computer via USB-C port right here. And then you can use the Samyang Lens App Manager, or Samyang Lens Manager app to adjust the manual focus sensitivity setting. This is really great for astrophotography because you can make the manual focus ring here less sensitive, which means that you can be more precise with your manual focus adjustment to ensure perfectly tacked sharp stars. If you've shot a lot of astrophotography, you've undoubtedly used a lens where, like a quarter turn takes you from the front to the back of the focus range, and it is just impossible to get perfectly tacked sharp stars. So being able to go into that app and then actually change this so that the focus happens slower makes it perfect to for those night photography, for focusing on those stars. Now, when it comes to the actual build of the lens itself, it's got a really nice feel to it. It has these two textured grips on the manual focus ring and the zoom ring. Those are two different textures, so if you're feeling it in the dark, you could definitely feel those out. Now, the lens grows a little bit as you zoom out just slightly, and you also have a switch on here for autofocus or manual focus. You can switch back and forth. Now, you also have one custom button on the outside. You can set it to whatever you desire. I personally use the zebra setting for my lens custom button. Now, truly the only downside to using this lens, in my opinion, is that it is obviously off-brand, and compared to some of the Sony options, Sony limits you at 15 frames per second. Sony does this because they want to encourage you to purchase first-party lenses. This definitely makes a big difference on things like telephotos or any kind of lens that you're going to use for maybe sports or wildlife. But on an ultra wide like this, you're most likely not shooting sports or wildlife, and so you're not really needing that 15 or higher than 15 FPS, I should say. Additionally, if you are going to be using this lens for video, you aren't going to receive quite as good of in-camera stabilization. I threw this thing on my ZVE1. It does not perform quite as well as the 16 to 25 when I use some of those in-camera stabilization modes. Now, most of you guys watching this are probably photographers, and that's probably something that doesn't matter to you. But if you are someone who's going to be shooting with it, and you're shooting with a camera totally handheld, and you want that stabilization to work really well, you do probably want to stick with the native Sony lens. But otherwise, for just straight photography purpose, there's really no downside to this thing other than that FPS. So to conclude here, I truly do think this is the best ultra wide lens for landscape and astrophotographers with Sony cameras. All of these features stack up to make it better than any of the other options on the market. The image quality is definitely comparable to even the most expensive G-Master options out there. I've been using this thing for quite some time now, as I mentioned. So if you do have any questions or you want to see any other examples using the lens, please let me know down below in the comments. Otherwise, be sure to leave me a subscribe and a like. It helps me to grow my channel. I can keep delivering you guys these videos every single week. Thank you guys so much, and we'll see you guys next time.